When I walked into the courtroom, my daughter smirked, and my white son-in-law just shook his head. The judge went completely pale. His hand trembled as he gripped his gavel and whispered, "My God, is it really him?" Everyone turned and stared at me. No one in that room had a single clue who I really was. My name is Harlan Thorne. I am an African-American man, 70 years of age, and I spent my entire life building a legacy my family tried to steal. I wore faded denim and kept a low profile, letting them believe I was just a tired old man. I am going to share exactly how I destroyed their arrogant facade. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your true worth. Let me take you back to the exact night where this nightmare began. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, my 70th birthday dinner. I sat quietly at the head of the massive glass dining table inside the sterile minimalist penthouse my daughter Kendra shared with her white husband, Bradley Hayes. The walls were painted a stark, clinical white, completely devoid of any warmth or family photographs. There were no festive balloons. There were no wrapped presents. There was not even a single slice of birthday cake to mark the milestone. Instead, Bradley confidently adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit, reached into his designer leather briefcase, and slid a thick, glossy brochure across the cold glass surface. The bold, patronizing letters on the cover read, "Pinecrest Memory Care." I looked at the insulting brochure, then slowly looked up at the two of them. I wore my usual faded denim jacket and comfortable work boots. Bradley had always openly hated how I dressed. He firmly believed my humble appearance was a severe embarrassment to his carefully curated image as an elite tech startup founder. Kendra stubbornly refused to meet my eyes, focusing intently on inspecting her expensive manicured fingernails. The silence in the room stretched uncomfortably until Bradley finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table with a look of extreme manufactured pity. Bradley forcefully tapped the brochure with his index finger. He spoke in that slow, condescending tone people reserve when speaking to a helpless child. "We need to have a very serious conversation about your future, Harlan. Your historic neighborhood is undergoing massive gentrification right now. The property value has skyrocketed to unprecedented levels, but the daily upkeep is clearly getting to be too much for you to handle. You are rattling around that big old house completely alone since Yvonne passed away. It is simply not safe for you anymore." I did not touch the glossy brochure. I stared directly into his arrogant eyes. "My house is perfectly fine, Bradley. It is fully paid off and meticulously maintained." Bradley shook his head, offering a loud theatrical sigh. "That is exactly what we are worried about. You are rapidly losing your grip on reality. Just last week, you completely forgot the name of that new streaming app my tech company is developing. You wear the exact same old clothes every single day. We cannot risk you leaving the stove on or wandering aimlessly into the busy street." Kendra finally looked up, her expression hardening into absolute callousness. "Dad, you are becoming a massive financial and emotional burden to us. Bradley is burning through essential capital trying to keep his startup afloat, and we simply cannot afford to hire round-the-clock nurses to babysit you." Bradley pulled a second document from his leather briefcase, a thick stack of legal papers featuring the official seal of the county clerk. "I have already taken the liberty of assuming preliminary control of the property, Harlan. We are listing the house on the market tomorrow morning. The capital from the sale will instantly secure my application development and ensure you have a modest room at Pinecrest. It is the responsible, logical choice for everyone involved." He pushed a heavy silver pen across the glass table. "Just sign the preliminary housing transfer, and we will expertly handle the rest of the messy logistics. You will not have to worry about a single bill ever again." The sheer audacity hung heavy in the air. They were actively using my quiet demeanor and my absolute lack of interest in Bradley's shallow tech world as fabricated evidence of senility. They wanted to quickly liquidate the home I shared with my late wife just to bail out a failing tech company. I completely ignored Bradley, and turned my attention entirely to Kendra, the African-American daughter I had proudly raised. I worked double shifts at the municipal office for 10 brutal years just to pay your Ivy League tuition in pure cash. I made absolutely certain you graduated without a single cent of crushing student loan debt. I sacrificed my own comfort so you could walk onto that elite campus wearing the best clothes and holding your head high. You never wanted for anything in your entire life. I kept my voice perfectly level, suppressing the righteous anger boiling inside me. I did not mention that I was never a simple clerk at that municipal office. I did not mention that my rigorous career as a federal forensic auditor for the Department of Justice allowed me to quietly purchase that entire office building along with most of the downtown commercial district. I lived simply because I absolutely despised the ostentatious displays of wealth that easily corrupted shallow people like Bradley. I lived modestly to test my daughter's true character. She had failed the test completely and spectacularly. Kendra rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly at my words. That was 20 years ago, Dad. Stop living in the past. You desperately need specialized care, and Bradley desperately needs the capital. Just sign the transfer. I slowly picked up the silver pen. Bradley smiled, a greedy, triumphant smirk spreading across his pale face. He truly thought he had won. He firmly believed I was just a tired, broken old man surrendering to his aggressive authority. I gripped the silver pen, snapped it cleanly in half, and dropped the broken pieces directly onto the glossy brochure. I picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly into a precise square, and placed it beside my empty dinner plate. I am not signing anything, I stated with absolute, unwavering finality. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the penthouse without looking back a single time. The elevator ride down to the lobby was perfectly quiet. I retrieved my 1999 sedan from the valet and drove through the illuminated city streets, my mind coldly calculating every legal and financial vulnerability Bradley possessed. I parked in my driveway, eager to step into the familiar sanctuary of my home. I walked up the concrete steps to my front porch and reached into my pocket for my keys. I froze in my tracks. The solid brass deadbolt I had installed myself was completely mangled. A heavy industrial steel padlock was drilled directly into the center of my front door. I stepped back, looking down at the driveway. Deep tire tracks brutally cut through Yvonne's precious rose bushes. A massive commercial moving truck was parked at the end of the street. While we were sitting at the dinner table, Bradley had dispatched a ruthless crew to lock me out of my own life. He had struck first. The heavy steel padlock gleamed under the amber glow of the porch light, a brutal declaration of war mounted directly onto my own front door. A massive commercial moving truck idled at the curb, its exhaust choking the quiet neighborhood street. I stood motionless in the driveway, my mind processing the sheer audacity of the scene before me. The front door unlocked from the inside. Bradley stepped out onto the porch. He wore a pristine cashmere sweater and expensive designer sneakers, perfectly portraying the successful tech founder he desperately pretended to be. He dragged a heavy black contractor bag across the threshold. The cheap plastic caught on the doorframe and tore open violently. Dozens of vintage vinyl records spilled out, crashing onto the wet grass. I instantly recognized the faded cardboard sleeves. Coltrane Fitzgerald Davis. My late wife Yvonne had spent 30 years meticulously curating that jazz collection. She had hunted down rare first pressings in dusty record shops across Chicago and New Orleans. It was the only tangible piece of her soul left in this world. Bradley casually kicked a cracked Coltrane record aside with the toe of his pristine sneaker. He did not look the least bit apologetic. He looked entirely in control. He loudly informed me that the real estate staging company demanded they declutter the house immediately to maximize the square footage for potential buyers. He stated that keeping old junk like this lying around actively dropped the property value and hindered his investment strategy. I looked at the records sinking into the damp lawn. I looked at the man who had married my daughter. He was deliberately attempting to provoke a violent physical reaction. He wanted me to scream in anger. He wanted me to swing my fists at him so he could fully justify placing the heavy padlock on the front door. I remained perfectly still. My breathing stayed slow and measured. Decades of working hostile forensic interrogations for the Department of Justice had taught me exactly how to control my heart rate in the face of sheer, arrogant aggression. I simply asked him by what legal authority he had locked me out of the home I purchased and fully paid off 40 years ago. Bradley laughed. It was a dry, utterly humorless sound that echoed across the empty yard. He reached into the inside pocket of his cashmere sweater and pulled out a sharply folded legal document. He held it up triumphantly in the dim light of the porch. The document featured the official embossed stamp of the county clerk. Bradley unfolded it slowly, making absolutely sure I could see my own signature flawlessly replicated at the bottom of the final page. He informed me it was a comprehensive medical and financial proxy. He explained that Kendra and a highly cooperative private physician had signed legal affidavits earlier this afternoon. Those affidavits officially declared me mentally unfit to manage my own financial affairs or maintain a safe living environment. The forgery was immaculate. Kendra knew exactly where I kept my old tax returns and must have traced my signature perfectly to execute the fraud. She had sold out her own father to subsidize her husband's failing business. Bradley smirked, leaning heavily against the wooden porch railing. He boldly announced that the house was officially under his legal guardianship now. I told him forgery is a federal offense punishable by a significant prison sentence. Bradley just shook his head, thoroughly amused by my factual statement. He crossed his arms and dictated his twisted version of the current reality. He proudly stated he was a prominent technology CEO with a pristine public image, a massive social media following, and a luxury residence in an elite zip code. He then pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. He described me as a 70-year-old African-American man standing on a lawn in a faded denim jacket, wearing scuffed work boots, wildly claiming his own daughter stole his house. He took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. He dropped his voice to a menacing, arrogant whisper. He told me to call the police right now. He practically begged me to take out my phone and dial 911. He promised that when the squad cars arrived, he would show the responding officers the signed medical proxy. He would tell them a tragic, convincing story about a confused, displaced old man who wandered away from his designated caregivers. He guaranteed the police would automatically view him as the responsible, wealthy white son-in-law desperately trying to protect his sick family member. He assured me they would forcibly escort me to a psychiatric holding facility before midnight if I caused a scene. He stood there on my porch, bathing in his own perceived invincibility, eagerly waiting for me to break. He expected a massive tantrum. He expected an old man crying out for his daughter's mercy. I did not shout. I did not beg for access to my own home. I did not pull out my phone to dial the police. I knelt on the damp grass and meticulously gathered Yvonne's records one by one. I carefully wiped the mud from the cardboard sleeves using the hem of my faded denim jacket. I stacked them securely under my arm, ensuring not a single piece of her precious legacy remained on the ground for him to trample. I stood back up and looked Bradley directly in the cold eyes. I did not say a single word to him. I turned my back on the house I purchased 40 years ago. I walked down the driveway, leaving Bradley standing alone on the porch, with a deeply confused frown replacing his arrogant smirk. I did not get into my old sedan parked on the street. I needed the intense physical exertion to clear my mind and formulate the exact sequence of my retaliation. I walked 3 miles through the cooling city streets, leaving the quiet residential neighborhood behind. I headed straight toward the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district, where the real power in this city resided. I arrived at the towering corporate headquarters of First Sterling Bank. I completely bypassed the crowded public teller lines and walked toward a discreet, unmarked alcove in the rear lobby. I placed my thumb on a hidden biometric scanner embedded in the marble wall. A heavy steel panel slid open seamlessly, revealing a private high-speed elevator. I descended directly to the subterranean corporate vault. Mitchell was already waiting for me inside the secure conference room. He was my primary wealth manager and aggressive corporate attorney, the only man alive who knew the full, terrifying extent of the apex capital empire I had built in absolute anonymity. He took one look at my damp denim jacket and the stack of ruined vinyl records in my arms. He knew immediately that a line had been crossed. I sat across from him at the heavy mahogany table. I did not offer a polite greeting. I instructed Mitchell to immediately access the primary corporate credit lines currently subsidizing Bradley Hayes and his struggling tech startup. I issued a single irrevocable directive. I ordered Mitchell to freeze every single cent of Bradley's operational capital before the morning business cycle began. I sat in the leather armchair of an anonymous high-end hotel suite overlooking the financial district. The suite was paid for in cash and booked under a corporate alias, making my physical location completely untraceable. Decades of rigorous federal audit work taught me the absolute necessity of establishing a secure operational base when collapsing a corrupt enterprise. The room was perfectly silent, providing a stark contrast to the massive storm I had just unleashed. The city below moved with its usual frantic rhythm, entirely unaware of the financial execution I had authorized hours ago. The heavy mahogany desk in front of me held only my laptop and a secure mobile phone. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the electronic silence broke. My phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood. The screen illuminated with Bradley's name. I watched the device rattle across the desk until it rolled to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it rang again. Then came the text messages. They arrived in rapid succession, painting a crystal-clear picture of the absolute chaos currently unfolding inside his glass-walled corporate office. Bradley's tech startup, ostensibly valued at $50 million by superficial trade magazines, ran entirely on the massive shadow subsidies I covertly channeled through a Tier 3 shell corporation. He arrogantly believed his inherent genius alone attracted anonymous angel investors. He never once bothered to trace the complex routing numbers back to Apex Capital. Mitchell had executed my freeze order with surgical precision at 3 in the morning. When Bradley's automated payroll system attempted to distribute monthly salaries to his 75 employees this morning, the transactions slammed into a solid financial wall. The corporate credit lines were dead. His operational capital was non-existent. The grand illusion of his success evaporated in less than 5 hours. My phone screen lit up with a new message from Kendra. It was a frantic demand to call her husband immediately. She claimed a devastating banking error was destroying their lives, and that I needed to wire them emergency funds from my retirement account. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I did not reply to my daughter. I waited patiently for the mounting desperation to completely strip away their highly curated masks. The phone started ringing for the 7th consecutive time. I finally picked the device up and accepted the call. I did not offer a polite greeting. Bradley did not bother with any pleasantries. He bypassed his usual condescending tone entirely. He screamed directly into the receiver with a shrill, hysterical pitch that bordered on sheer madness. He demanded to know exactly what I had done to his accounts. He accused me of calling his little pension bank and maliciously freezing his authorized transfer out of pure bitter spite. He actually believed my meager civil service retirement fund was somehow magically linked to his massive corporate accounts, because I had once signed as a guarantor on his initial business loan 5 years ago. He shouted that his chief financial officer was currently threatening to resign, and that his lead software developers were actively packing up their desks and walking out the door. He claimed Kendra fully supported his extreme anger. He insisted my daughter wanted absolutely nothing to do with a man who would intentionally sabotage her husband's brilliance out of petty jealousy. He demanded I contact the bank and authorize the immediate release of my entire life savings to bridge the gaping hole his bounced payroll created. He told me it was the only possible way I could ever earn my way back into their good graces and secure a place in their home. The sheer delusion was absolutely staggering. He truly believed he held the high moral ground, while shamelessly begging an old man for cash. I let him vent his pure, unfiltered panic. I listened closely to his breathing grow heavy and ragged. He ordered me to drive my old rusted sedan down to the local bank branch right this second and clear up the senile mistake I had made. When I remained perfectly silent, Bradley resorted to the ultimate emotional blackmail. He lowered his voice into a vicious, trembling snarl. He told me that Kendra was pregnant. He stated that if I did not fix his money immediately, he would permanently bar me from ever meeting my future grandchildren. He promised I would die alone in a state facility completely erased from their perfect family legacy. He claimed Yvonne would be absolutely disgusted by my selfish, erratic behavior. Hearing him casually invoke my late wife's name to extort money extinguished the final microscopic trace of my paternal restraint. He was using a hypothetical child as a cheap bargaining chip to secure operational capital. He viewed human beings purely as financial leverage. I analyzed his rapid vocal patterns, the slight tremor in his frantic breath, the heavy pacing I could easily hear through the phone speaker. He was not a commanding tech visionary. He was a terrified, pathetic child watching his stolen sandcastle collapse into the ocean. I waited until he finally stopped to take a ragged breath. I kept my voice perfectly flat, utterly devoid of any warmth or mercy. I spoke with the precise, lethal articulation of a federal prosecutor delivering a grand jury indictment. I informed Bradley that there was no banking glitch. I explained clearly that the six-figure monthly subsidies silently keeping his fraudulent enterprise afloat for the past 5 years had been permanently terminated by the primary investor. I told him he was no longer authorized to draw breath on my dime. Bradley stopped speaking. A suffocating, heavy silence fell over the line as his brain desperately tried to process the catastrophic reality of my words. He stammered weakly, asking how a retired municipal clerk could possibly control his vast corporate funding. I did not provide an answer. I did not owe him the courtesy of a detailed explanation regarding my true identity or my wealth. I gave him a single, non-negotiable ultimatum. I told him he had exactly 24 hours to remove the heavy steel padlock from my front door and return the forged medical proxy documents to my attorney. I stated that if the locks were not removed by tomorrow morning, the financial freeze would aggressively expand to his personal assets, his luxury vehicles, and the penthouse he currently shared with my daughter. I hung up the phone before he could formulate a coherent response. I placed the device face down on the mahogany desk. The swift execution of consequence was fully in motion. I knew a desperate man like Bradley would not simply accept defeat. He would perceive my boundary as a direct attack on his fragile ego. Bradley retaliated with terrifying speed. Less than 2 hours after our phone call, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed through the quiet hotel suite. I did not order room service. I walked to the door and looked through the brass peephole. 2 massive men wearing clinical white polo shirts and heavy tactical belts stood in the hallway. They were private medical orderlies built like nightclub bouncers holding thick canvas restraints in their hands. Behind them stood 2 armed municipal police officers looking incredibly tense. Bradley had unlawfully tracked my mobile phone's location. He had taken the forged medical proxy straight to a corrupt local judge and filed an emergency ex parte psychiatric hold. He claimed his elderly father-in-law was actively suicidal, financially erratic, and a profound danger to himself and the general public. The lock on my hotel door clicked loudly as the manager, clearly intimidated by the sudden police presence, used a master key card to grant them access from the outside. The heavy wooden door swung open. The medical orderlies stepped inside the room, unwinding their heavy canvas straps with practiced menace. The lead police officer placed a firm hand on his holstered weapon and loudly ordered me to step away from the desk and put my hands where he could see them. Bradley had officially escalated the conflict from corporate financial warfare to physical capture. The lead officer kept his hand resting heavily on his holster, his gaze locked onto my chest as if I were a coiled spring ready to snap. The 2 massive orderlies stepped forward, unspooling their heavy canvas restraints with a practiced, intimidating rhythm. Decades of dismantling federal corruption rings and interrogating desperate, violent men had taught me one absolute truth regarding systemic traps. Physical resistance against a uniformed officer instantly validates every single lie your enemies have filed against you. I did not tense my shoulders. I did not raise my voice or demand my immediate right to legal counsel. I slowly lifted my hands, palms open and facing forward, and stepped away from the heavy mahogany desk. I instructed them with a calm, perfectly measured tone that I would comply with their transport order without any need for physical restraints. The officers exchanged a brief, uncertain look, clearly anticipating a violent struggle from an allegedly erratic and dangerous old man. Finding none, they escorted me out of the hotel suite and into the back of a municipal transport vehicle. Within the hour, I was sitting alone inside a sterile psychiatric holding room at a private high-security medical facility. The room was entirely devoid of color or comfort. The walls were painted a blinding clinical white, and the air smelled sharply of industrial bleach and institutional apathy. The heavy steel door locked behind me with a resounding, hollow thud. I sat perfectly still on the edge of a rigid vinyl-covered examination bed. I did not pace the floor. I did not bang my fists against the reinforced glass of the observation window. I regulated my breathing, lowering my heart rate to a steady, resting rhythm. I knew exactly what Bradley was attempting to accomplish. He wanted to break my spirit through the sheer, terrifying isolation of involuntary confinement. He wanted me to panic, to yell, to act like a paranoid, delusional senior citizen. I refused to give him the satisfaction. I conserved my energy cataloging every detail of the room and preparing my mind for the inevitable psychological ambush. The heavy steel door swung open, and a man wearing a crisp white laboratory coat stepped into the holding room. He carried a digital tablet and wore a strained, overly practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. His name badge identified him as Dr. Arrington. He pulled up a plastic chair, sitting entirely too close, invading my personal space in a deliberate attempt to establish immediate psychological dominance. He spoke to me using the slow, highly exaggerated cadence one might use when addressing a toddler or a profoundly deaf animal. He asked me if I knew what year it was, who the current president was, and if I understood why my loving family was so terribly concerned about my aggressive outbursts. I did not answer his insulting questions immediately. I engaged my forensic training, systematically dissecting the man sitting in front of me. I noticed the heavy layer of nervous perspiration beading along his receding hairline despite the freezing temperature of the holding room. I observed the slight rhythmic tremor in his left hand as he tapped his stylus against the digital tablet. My eyes locked onto his wrist. He was wearing a gaudy, oversized gold watch, but the second hand ticked with the distinct, jagged motion of a cheap quartz replica, not the smooth sweep of a genuine luxury timepiece. His Italian leather shoes were severely scuffed at the toes, and the heels indicating a man trying desperately to project massive wealth while actively drowning in private financial ruin. He was the exact demographic of a highly educated professional vulnerable to quick, illegal cash. I leaned forward, matching his posture. I clearly stated the exact date, the current time down to the minute, and the full name of the acting president. I then recited a complex string of 16 randomly generated numbers I had memorized from my hotel room telephone keypad, just to demonstrate flawless short-term retention. I calmly explained the intricate macroeconomic variables currently affecting the city's commercial real estate market, utilizing terminology that made his jaw visibly slacken. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and informed him that I was perfectly aware he was aggressively attempting to fabricate a medical diagnosis of severe dementia. I told him his methodology was sloppy, his leading questions were legally indefensible, and his obvious anxiety proved he knew exactly how much federal prison time a physician faced for committing medical fraud. Dr. Arrington swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically against the collar of his expensive shirt. The arrogant, condescending demeanor completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, compromised man. He looked away from my piercing gaze, unable to sustain the intense eye contact. He knew with absolute certainty that my cognitive functions were sharper and far more lethal than his own. He knew I possessed the intellectual capacity to utterly destroy his medical career in a court of law. Yet his trembling fingers moved across the digital tablet, pulling up the final authorization screen for a preliminary certificate of mental incompetence. He let out a ragged, defeated sigh. He whispered that my son-in-law had wired $50,000 into an offshore account just 3 hours ago. He confessed that he was entirely buried in insurmountable gambling debts and desperately needed the cash to prevent violent loan sharks from coming after his family. He looked at me with pathetic, watery eyes, begging for my understanding, as if his own financial incompetence justified locking a perfectly sane man in a psychiatric ward. He pressed his digital stylus against the screen and callously signed his name, officially certifying my fabricated dementia. He placed his own survival above his medical oath, and my basic human rights sealing the corrupt bargain. He stood up abruptly, tucked the tablet under his arm, and practically ran out of the holding room, leaving me alone with the devastating consequences of his cowardice. Because the initial psychiatric hold was based solely on a preliminary evaluation, and not a comprehensive court order. The facility was legally obligated to release me pending a full judicial hearing scheduled for the following morning. I walked out through the heavy glass doors of the psychiatric ward just as the sun began to set, stepping into the crisp evening air. The security guard returned my personal belongings in a clear plastic bag. I retrieved my mobile phone and turned the screen on. I instantly accessed the local real estate databases through my holding company's secure server. I needed to see exactly how quickly Bradley was moving to capitalize on his fraudulent victory. My stomach tightened as the search results loaded. Bradley had not wasted a single second. Utilizing the freshly signed preliminary incompetence form to bypass the bank's standard verification protocols, he had officially listed my historic home on the public real estate market. The listing boasted an aggressive below-market cash price designed for an immediate, unquestioned sale. Bradley was accelerating his timeline to completely liquidate my legacy before I could even step foot inside a courtroom. The heavy oak doors of the county family courthouse swung shut, sealing the humid morning air outside. Inside Department 4, the atmosphere was thick, with the distinct scent of polished wood and impending legal execution. I sat completely alone at the defendant's table. I wore the exact faded denim jacket and scuffed boots I had worn the night they locked me out. I did not hire a defense attorney to sit beside me. I did not need one to navigate a room governed by the absolute rule of law. Across the center aisle at the plaintiff's table, Bradley and Kendra sat shoulder to shoulder, radiating an aura of manufactured grief and aggressive entitlement. Bradley wore a bespoke charcoal gray Italian suit. His posture was rigid, projecting the supreme confidence of a man who firmly believed his vast wealth made him entirely bulletproof. He occasionally adjusted his silk tie, his eyes darting toward the gallery to ensure the spectators recognized his elite status. Kendra sat beside him, wearing a conservative but undeniably expensive black designer dress. She kept her posture deliberately small, her head bowed in a calculated display of a heartbroken daughter forced into making a tragic decision. She did not look at me. She stared intently at the polished mahogany table, clutching a pristine white handkerchief in her manicured hands. They looked like the perfect, responsible couple burdened by an impossible family tragedy. I remained perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the table before me. I regulated my breathing, lowering my heart rate to a steady, resting rhythm. I observed the bailiff organizing the docket files. I noted the court reporter adjusting her stenography machine. Bradley leaned over and whispered something into Kendra's ear. She offered a tight, solemn nod, dabbing the dry corners of her eyes with her handkerchief. They were fully prepared to deliver the performance of a lifetime, firmly convinced that the legal system would simply rubber stamp their fraudulent medical proxy without a second thought. Bradley's expensive corporate attorney stood up as proceedings began, but Bradley quickly waved him down. He wanted the floor. He wanted to be the primary architect of my public humiliation. Bradley approached the center podium with the smooth, practiced stride of a tech executive pitching a billion-dollar startup to gullible venture capitalists. He placed the forged medical documents heavily onto the wooden stand, ensuring the county clerk's embossed seal was visible to the entire room. He began his address with a heavy theatrical sigh, projecting his voice to reach the back rows of the gallery. He painted a masterful, devastating portrait of a man who had completely lost his grip on reality. He described me as a tragic figure, a once proud municipal worker whose mind had rapidly deteriorated since the untimely passing of his beloved wife. He falsely claimed I wandered the city streets at all hours of the night in unwashed clothes, unable to remember basic details about my own life or family. He dramatically presented the corrupt psychiatrist's evaluation, reading the fabricated diagnosis of severe late-stage dementia aloud for the court record. He firmly asserted allowing me to retain control of the estate was extreme negligence. He argued that my historic home, a property sitting on prime, highly sought-after real estate, was deteriorating rapidly due to my profound cognitive incompetence. He stated that the generational wealth I was currently hoarding and wasting needed to be immediately transferred into a secure trust managed by responsible, lucid family members. At the plaintiff's table, Kendra executed her role with chilling precision, as Bradley recounted a completely fabricated story about finding me lost and confused in my own backyard. She pressed the white handkerchief to her face. She let out a soft, audible sob, expertly wiping away entirely fake tears. She played the agonizingly conflicted daughter to absolute perfection, manipulating the emotional atmosphere of the courtroom to validate her husband's ruthless financial takeover. Bradley concluded his opening statement by demanding the court immediately validate the medical proxy and grant him permanent, irrevocable guardianship over my life and my assets. He stepped back from the podium, offering the empty judge's chair a look of grave, manufactured sorrow. He turned and shot me a swift, triumphant smirk, entirely confident that his expensive suit and forged medical papers had successfully sealed my absolute ruin. Silence fell over the room as the wooden door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff sharply ordered the courtroom to rise. The Honorable Marcus Sullivan walked to his high-backed leather chair. Judge Sullivan was a stern, uncompromising magistrate known throughout the district for his absolute intolerance of frivolous litigation. He sat down, heavily adjusting his reading glasses as he opened the thick docket file Bradley had aggressively fast-tracked onto his morning schedule. Sullivan scanned the preliminary plaintiff summaries without a trace of emotion. He flipped the page to examine the defendant's name. His reading glasses slipped down his nose. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes moving past Bradley and Kendra, scanning the defendant's table. His gaze locked directly onto my face. The stern, uncompromising magistrate went completely pale. The healthy color drained entirely from his weathered cheeks. His hand resting on the heavy wooden gavel began to tremble uncontrollably. He stared at the faded denim jacket, the calm posture, the unblinking eyes. He leaned back in his chair, a raw, undeniable shock washing over his features. He whispered barely loud enough for the court reporter to catch. "My God. Is it really him 20 years ago?" Marcus Sullivan was an ambitious federal prosecutor aggressively targeting a deeply entrenched municipal mafia syndicate. His relentless pursuit had triggered a brutal assassination contract against his life. I was the anonymous Department of Justice forensic auditor who intercepted the syndicate's encrypted financial ledgers. I systematically dismantled their entire money laundering network in 48 hours, severing their operational funding and neutralizing the assassination plot before the hitmen could even acquire Sullivan's home address. I never claimed public credit, but Sullivan had seen my face during a highly classified federal debriefing. He knew exactly who Harlan Thorne was. He knew I possessed a mind sharper than a scalpel. Judge Sullivan removed his glasses, his hands shaking violently. He did not address Bradley's elaborate opening statement. He did not acknowledge Kendra's manufactured tears. Sullivan slammed his gavel down with a deafening crack. He aggressively threw the forged psychiatric evaluation across his desk, declaring it completely inadmissible and a blatant insult to the court. He issued an immediate severe judicial sanction against Bradley for filing fraudulent medical documents and ordered a full state investigation into the corrupt psychiatrist who signed them. The courtroom erupted into stunned whispers. Bradley's triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. His bulletproof plan had inexplicably disintegrated in seconds. He grabbed his designer briefcase, shoving his chair back violently. He stormed past the defendant's table, his face flushed red with rage. He did not leave quietly. He paused directly behind my chair, leaning down until I could feel his hot, ragged breath against my ear. He dropped his voice to a venomous whisper. "You think you won this, old man?" The house was sold to a private cash buyer exactly 1 hour before this hearing started. The wire transfer cleared, and the money is already sitting in an offshore account. You are completely homeless. I let Bradley's venomous whisper dissolve into the heavy, stagnant air of the courtroom. I did not flinch. I watched him storm through the double wooden doors, a desperate, cornered man, clinging tightly to a fleeting illusion of absolute victory. I stood up slowly, smoothed the lapels of my faded denim jacket, and walked out of the courthouse without looking back at the gallery. The humid afternoon heat hit me immediately, but my mind was completely submerged in a state of cold, calculating ice. I flagged down a passing city taxi and gave the driver the specific address for the Apex Capital corporate headquarters. The ride took exactly 14 tense minutes through the congested downtown traffic. I entered the towering glass structure, completely bypassing the crowded public reception desk, and stepped directly into the private executive elevator. I rode it to the top floor, where the atmosphere was governed by absolute insulated silence. Mitchell was already furiously pacing the length of the polished boardroom when I walked through the doors. He had received the court transcript via our secure legal channels and knew all about the judicial sanction. However, the offshore wire transfer Bradley had orchestrated was a brand new, highly volatile variable. I relayed Bradley's final threat word for word. Mitchell stopped pacing instantly. His professional expression hardened into pure predatory focus. He immediately deployed his elite legal team to petition an emergency federal injunction. But we both knew the harsh, uncompromising reality of international banking laws. We were fighting a ruthless, ticking clock. A standard offshore wire transfer, initiated by a private cash buyer, required a mandatory holding period before the funds completely cleared international jurisdictions. We had less than 12 hours before the money evaporated into the untraceable ether of shadow accounts in the Cayman Islands. If that digital clock hit zero, the physical deed to the home I built with Yvonne would be permanently legally transferred to an absolute ghost. I took off my denim jacket and draped it over the back of a leather executive chair. I rolled up my sleeves, preparing for war. Mitchell slid a high-powered, fully encrypted laptop across the smooth mahogany table. I opened the device and logged into the secured mainframe. I was no longer the tired, discarded old man standing helplessly on a wet lawn. I completely dropped the passive, harmless grandfather persona that had successfully baited Bradley into exposing his own brazen fraud. I reawakened the precise, methodical federal forensic auditor who had spent 3 highly classified decades dissecting complex financial conspiracies for the Department of Justice. My fingers flew across the keyboard with lethal, practiced familiarity. I immediately bypassed the standard public property registry, which was entirely useless for tracking dark money. Instead, I breached the restricted federal property transfer databases, utilizing my active high-level security clearance. I pulled up the exact digital ledger for my residential address. Bradley had executed the rapid sale through an automated, heavily encrypted digital escrow service, specifically designed to completely mask the identity of the end buyer until the funds fully cleared the central bank. I isolated the unique routing numbers attached directly to the incoming cash wire. I aggressively traced the digital signature backward through an intricate, intentionally confusing labyrinth of dummy corporations, blind trusts, and phantom holding companies. The buyer was definitely not a random wealthy family looking to gentrify my historic neighborhood. The purchasing entity was officially listed in the International Registry as Obsidian Holdings. I recognized that specific corporate structure instantly. 20 years ago, I had memorized the operational blueprints and shell company networks of every major criminal enterprise operating within the state limits. Obsidian Holdings was a notorious, impenetrable shell company belonging exclusively to the Toretti lending syndicate. They were a highly organized, incredibly vicious underground organization that specialized in predatory loans, brutal extortion, and aggressive forced property seizures. They did not buy residential real estate to live in or flip for a modest, legitimate profit. They acquired domestic properties purely as forced collateral for defaulted high-risk criminal loans. I ran a secondary cross-reference matrix directly matching Bradley's primary personal bank accounts with the syndicate's known extortion ledgers. The data aligned perfectly on the screen. The puzzle pieces snapped together to form a terrifying, undeniable picture. The narrative Bradley had confidently sold to my daughter and his wealthy investors was a complete calculated fabrication. Bradley did not sell my home to generate operational capital for his struggling tech startup. His heavily promoted application development company was merely a convenient, legitimate front to launder his own colossal personal failures. He had sold my house to pay off massive, incredibly dangerous underground gambling debts. He had heavily leveraged his lavish lifestyle, his marriage, and ultimately my wife's legacy just to keep the Toretti syndicate from breaking his legs. His arrogant desperation at the birthday dinner, his frantic attempt to legally declare me mentally incompetent, the forged medical proxy. It was all driven entirely by the primal suffocating fear of violent men coming to collect their overdue blood money. He had stolen my home to buy his own life. I stared at the glowing computer screen, fully processing the sheer cowardly depth of his betrayal. Before I could instruct Mitchell to initiate a hostile corporate block against the Toretti routing numbers, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom violently swung open. Kendra burst into the secure Apex Capital office, completely bypassing the strict lobby security protocols she somehow knew how to evade. Her pristine black designer dress was disheveled and torn at the hem. Her flawless courtroom makeup was completely ruined by genuine, terrified tears streaming down her face. She rushed across the expansive room and dropped heavily to her bare knees directly beside my leather chair. She grabbed my arm, sobbing uncontrollably, her entire body shaking with raw panic. The calculated, cold daughter from the courthouse was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified victim. She begged me to help them. She begged me to release the corporate freeze on Bradley's accounts immediately. She looked up at me with wide, panicked eyes and delivered a chilling confession. She claimed the syndicate would actively murder Bradley tonight if the offshore money was frozen. Kendra collapsed onto the thick carpet of the boardroom, clutching the arm of my leather chair. Her carefully cultivated image as a high society tech wife shattered completely as she wept. She gasped for air, claiming that Bradley was in immediate mortal danger. She spun a frantic narrative about ruthless loan sharks tracking his every movement, describing terrifying phone calls and menacing vehicles idling outside their penthouse. Mitchell took a deliberate step forward, his hand resting on the secure telephone line, ready to summon building security to remove her from the premises. I raised a single finger, instructing Mitchell to hold his position. I needed to see exactly how far my daughter was willing to take this elaborate performance. Kendra looked up at me, her mascara smudged her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine, unfiltered terror. She begged me to understand that Bradley had made a terrible mistake out of pure desperation. She claimed he only sold the house because the Toretti syndicate threatened to murder them both if he defaulted on his massive underground debts. She pleaded for my mercy, stating that freezing the offshore accounts was a literal death sentence for her husband. She reached into her torn designer bag with trembling hands and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers bound in a sleek blue folder. She pushed herself up from the floor, placing the document directly onto the mahogany table between us. She told me this was a universal settlement agreement drafted by the syndicate's private attorneys. She promised that if I signed it and released my legal claim to the stolen funds, the criminals would take their blood money and leave our family alone forever. She swore it was the only way to guarantee our physical safety. She framed the document as a necessary sacrifice, a final surrender of the house to save their lives. She stood there playing the absolute victim, desperately waiting for her father to blindly protect her from the consequences of their actions. I did not immediately reach for the blue folder. I studied my daughter's face in the harsh overhead lighting. Decades of dismantling federal financial crimes taught me to completely separate emotional manipulation from cold, hard documentation. I picked up the stack of papers and opened the heavy cover. I bypassed the standard introductory clauses and flipped directly to the dense, heavily formatted legal jargon buried deep within the third section. I read the fine print with the surgical precision of a seasoned forensic auditor. The document was not drafted by underground extortionists. The Toretti Syndicate did not utilize corporate indemnification clauses or civil liability waivers to collect their illegal gambling debts. This paperwork was meticulously constructed by a high-priced corporate defense firm. I analyzed the specific stipulations hidden beneath the complex legal terminology. The agreement did not authorize a direct payment to any offshore shell company. Instead, it explicitly and permanently indemnified Bradley Hayes from all state and federal fraud charges regarding the forged medical proxy and the subsequent illegal property sale. It legally bound me to officially testify that I had voluntarily surrendered the house to him in a perfectly sound state of mind. But the most damning clause was buried on the final page. It required my signature to irrevocably waive my right to pursue any civil or criminal litigation against Kendra. She was legally shielding herself from prison. I read the specific phrasing again, letting the sheer magnitude of her betrayal wash over me. She had not simply turned a blind eye to Bradley's desperate actions. She was not a terrified wife caught in the crossfire of her husband's crippling gambling addiction. The precise legal language protecting her personal assets and shielding her from complicity proved she was an active, willing participant in the theft. She had personally orchestrated the forgery of the medical proxy. She had knowingly provided Bradley with my private medical history, my signature samples, and my tax returns to guarantee the psychiatric hold would look entirely legitimate to a corrupt doctor. She had willingly sacrificed my freedom, my home, and my sanity to protect her lavish lifestyle from completely collapsing. The entire performance of bursting into my office in tears was nothing more than a calculated psychological ambush designed to manipulate my paternal instincts. She truly believed I would hastily sign away my entire legal recourse out of blind panic for her safety. She was utilizing my love for her as a weapon of mass destruction. I closed the blue folder and placed it flat on the table. I looked up at Kendra. The desperate weeping facade slipped slightly as she eagerly awaited my signature. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute freezing clarity. I told her I knew exactly what she had done. I detailed how she traced my signature, how she hired the corporate defense firm, and how she orchestrated the fake psychiatric evaluation. I told her the Toretti Syndicate did not draft legal immunity clauses for federal fraud. The blood drained entirely from her face. Her fake tears stopped instantly, replaced by a look of sheer horrified realization. She knew I had seen through the entire elaborate trap. I picked up the thick stack of legal documents in both hands. I gripped the papers firmly and tore the settlement agreement cleanly in half. I dropped the shredded pieces directly onto the polished mahogany table. I looked at the woman I had sacrificed everything to raise and felt absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. I informed her that she was no longer a victim in this scenario. She had actively conspired to lock her own father in a psychiatric ward to pay for a criminal debt. I told her she had chosen to ally herself with a fraudulent coward, and in doing so, she had chosen the absolute wrong side of the war. Kendra's expression twisted from terror into pure, unadulterated venom. The victim mask was completely gone. She glared at me with absolute hatred, fully realizing her ultimate manipulation had failed spectacularly. She spun around on her expensive heels and stormed out of the boardroom, the heavy oak doors slamming violently shut behind her. The silence returned to the office, heavy and utterly tense. Mitchell stepped forward to begin initiating the aggressive federal blocks against Bradley's remaining accounts. Exactly 10 minutes after Kendra fled the building, my secure mobile phone vibrated sharply on the desk. A single encrypted text message appeared on the screen. I opened the notification. It was a high-resolution photograph. My heart turned to absolute ice in my chest. The image displayed my late wife Yvonne's pristine marble headstone at the city cemetery. The beautiful engraved lettering was freshly defaced, covered entirely in thick, dripping red spray paint. The vandalism was a brutal, targeted desecration, the only thing I held sacred in this world. A brief text message from Bradley followed immediately beneath the horrifying image. The words were simple, arrogant, and lethal. "Sign the papers, or we stop playing nice." The glowing screen of my mobile phone illuminated the dark boardroom. The thick red spray paint dripping down Yvonne's pristine white marble headstone was a visceral, calculated violation. It was not merely vandalism. It was an aggressive desecration of the only pure thing left in my existence. Bradley had crossed a boundary that possessed no return trajectory. He mistakenly believed that attacking the memory of my late wife would completely shatter my resolve and force me into a panicked, emotional surrender. He failed to comprehend that his vile tactic achieved the exact opposite result. It entirely eradicated my final lingering ounce of paternal mercy. The compassion I had reserved for the mother of my grandchildren vanished in a single heartbeat, replaced by a cold, hollow void. Bradley wanted a war, and he had just guaranteed his own absolute destruction. I stared at the photograph, committing the brutal insult to the deepest, coldest part of my mind. I did not reply to his extortion text. I simply turned off the device and slipped it into my pocket. Mitchell stood frozen on the opposite side of the mahogany table, recognizing the absolute terrifying shift in my posture. I did not need to issue any further directives to my attorney. The legal maneuvers and federal injunctions were no longer sufficient for the magnitude of this specific betrayal. This conflict required a highly surgical, unconventional resolution outside the sterile confines of a courtroom. I picked up my faded denim jacket, draped it over my shoulders, and walked out of the Apex Capital headquarters without uttering a single word. I drove my old sedan through the rapidly darkening city streets, navigating away from the gleaming financial district and descending into the gritty industrial underbelly of the warehouse district. I pulled up to a heavily guarded, nondescript brick building tucked away in a desolate alley. To the untrained eye, it was just an abandoned meatpacking facility rotting in the shadows. To the highest echelons of the criminal underworld, it was the exclusive, highly secure cigar lounge that served as the primary operational hub for the Toretti lending syndicate. Two massive men wearing custom-tailored suits and earpieces stood outside the reinforced steel door. They immediately moved to intercept my approach, their hands drifting instinctively toward their concealed weapons. I did not slow my pace or display a single flicker of hesitation. I looked directly at the lead guard and stated my name with absolute authority. I instructed him to inform Vincent Toretti that the anonymous founder of Apex Capital was standing on his doorstep, ready to conduct a highly lucrative transaction. The heavy steel door swung open, and I was escorted through a dimly lit hallway reeking of expensive tobacco and aged leather. The guards patted me down with rough, invasive hands before leading me into a massive, opulent back room where Vincent Toretti sat holding court. He was a ruthless, aging patriarch who maintained absolute control over his illegal empire through sheer violence and financial extortion. He sat behind a massive desk carved from solid mahogany, surrounded by half a dozen armed lieutenants whose eyes tracked my every movement. Toretti took one look at my scuffed work boots and my faded denim jacket. A booming, mocking laugh erupted from his chest, echoing loudly across the smoky room. His lieutenants joined in immediately, thoroughly amused by the absurd sight of a 70-year-old African-American man walking unprotected into a deadly mafia stronghold. Toretti leaned forward, resting his heavy ringed hands on the desk, grinning like a predator examining wounded prey. He asked me if I was lost sarcastically, offering to call me a taxi back to whatever nursing home I had wandered away from. He told his men to go easy on me, assuming I was just a senile vagrant who had stumbled through the wrong door. I did not flinch. I did not offer a polite smile or break eye contact with the syndicate boss. I reached slowly into the inside pocket of my jacket, keeping my hands entirely visible, and pulled out a single, precisely folded piece of paper. I stepped forward, ignoring the guards tensing behind me, and placed it directly onto the center of his polished desk. The arrogant laughter in the room died instantly as Toretti looked down. It was a certified, entirely untraceable bank draft issued directly from an offshore Apex Capital shadow account. The monetary figure printed on the draft was exactly double the massive, suffocating gambling debt Bradley Hayes currently owed the syndicate. Toretti picked up the paper, his mocking expression vanishing entirely, replaced by a look of sharp, calculating greed. He meticulously checked the watermarks and the routing codes, his experienced eyes instantly recognizing legitimate liquid wealth. He looked at the astronomical number, then looked back up at my calm, unyielding face. The dynamic of power shifted completely in a matter of seconds. He demanded to know exactly what I wanted for this kind of cash. He assumed I was a desperate father trying to buy his reckless son-in-law a clean slate. He assumed I was paying an exorbitant premium to ensure Bradley's physical safety and permanently erase the violent target placed on his back. He completely misread my intentions. He thought he was dealing with a frightened civilian, willing to empty his retirement accounts to protect family. He had no idea he was negotiating with the apex predator of the city's commercial real estate market. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of fear or emotion. I explicitly informed Toretti that I was not purchasing amnesty or forgiveness. I was not paying for Bradley's safety or asking the syndicate to overlook his egregious financial transgressions. I stated clearly that I was executing a direct hostile acquisition of his outstanding liabilities. I was legally and fully purchasing Bradley's entire debt portfolio. Every single forged loan, every defaulted marker, and every ounce of violent leverage the mafia held over his pathetic life now belonged exclusively to me. Toretti stared at me in stunned silence, fully comprehending the sheer ruthless nature of the transaction. He realized I was not acting as a savior rescuing Bradley from the wolves. I was officially buying the leash from the wolves to hold it myself. I demanded the immediate transfer of all promissory notes, extortion files, and written confessions Bradley had surrendered to them. Toretti slowly nodded, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his hardened features as he pocketed the massive bank draft. He signaled his chief accountant to immediately unlock the safe and transfer the physical ledgers and digital extortion files into my possession. With a single decisive financial strike, the Toretti syndicate relinquished all claims to Bradley Hayes. I now owned my son-in-law entirely. His future, his freedom, and his miserable existence were firmly clutched in my hands. I placed the documents neatly into my jacket. I did not ask for a receipt. In the underworld, the transfer of leverage was absolute. I exited the smoky underground lounge holding a sleek black leather folder containing the absolute destruction of Bradley's life. I got back into my rusted sedan and drove directly toward my historic neighborhood. The night air was thick and humid, clinging to the windshield as I navigated the quiet residential streets. As I turned onto my block, a jarring barrage of thumping bass and blaring music assaulted the calm atmosphere. I parked my car against the curb and looked up at my stolen home. The heavy steel padlock from the previous night had been completely removed from the front door, replaced by a brand-new, high-security biometric locking system. The massive bay windows were brightly illuminated, showcasing dozens of moving silhouettes, dancing and drinking inside my living room. Bradley was clearly not hiding in terror from the lending syndicate. Believing his offshore wire transfer had successfully secured his stolen wealth and effectively erased his dangerous debts, he was aggressively celebrating his perceived victory. He had invited his wealthy tech investors and shallow startup colleagues to my house to flaunt his freshly acquired real estate. Bradley was throwing a massive, arrogant victory party right inside the home he had stolen from me, completely unaware that the executioner had just arrived at his front door. The bass vibrated through the floorboards of my car, mocking the very foundation of the life Yvonne and I had built. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the music. The heavy synthetic bass thumped violently against the pavement, a rhythmic, insulting pulse that mocked the decades of quiet dignity Yvonne and I had meticulously cultivated within those walls. The original antique brass fixtures we had sourced from a salvage yard in Charleston were completely gone, replaced by a cold, sleek biometric scanner glowing with a sterile blue light. I did not attempt to bypass the digital lock. I did not knock on the polished wood or ring the newly installed video doorbell. I stepped back, planted my left boot firmly on the porch, and drove my right heel directly into the center of the heavy oak door with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. The reinforced wood splintered violently around the deadbolt mechanism. The metal hinges shrieked as they were ripped entirely from the doorframe. The massive door swung inward with a deafening crash, slamming against the foyer wall and shattering a large decorative mirror into hundreds of jagged pieces. The thumping house music cut off, instantly replaced by a sharp, collective gasp of shock. I stepped over the ruined threshold, crushing sharp splinters of oak beneath my scuffed work boots. The grand living room, once a peaceful sanctuary of warm mahogany and soft lamplight, was completely packed with approximately 50 wealthy elite tech investors and corporate sycophants. They stood frozen like statues with expensive cocktails in their hands, their bespoke tailored suits and designer evening gowns completely at odds with the violent, sudden intrusion. The room smelled heavily of expensive catered food, spilled top-shelf liquor, and the distinct cloying scent of unearned arrogance. I stood framed perfectly in the ruined doorway, a 70-year-old man wearing a faded denim jacket, staring down a crowded room full of people who firmly believed they owned the world. No one moved a muscle. The sudden, absolute silence was suffocating and heavy. I locked my gaze onto the center of the room, slowly scanning the sea of shocked, privileged faces, until I found the cowardly architect of this desecration. Bradley stood arrogantly near the restored marble fireplace, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. He was flanked by 3 incredibly wealthy venture capitalists he had been aggressively courting all evening. The initial shock on his face rapidly morphed into a sneer of arrogant, dismissive contempt. He genuinely believed he held the ultimate high ground in this conflict. He firmly believed the offshore wire transfer had permanently insulated him from any legal consequences, leaving me as nothing more than a homeless, pathetic relic, lashing out in a futile, embarrassing tantrum. He let out a loud theatrical laugh that echoed sharply in the silent room. He turned to his wealthy associates and mockingly apologized for the sudden interruption, loudly declaring that his senile, mentally unstable father-in-law had somehow escaped his medical caregivers again. He snapped his fingers with an air of absolute authority, ordering 2 of his younger, highly athletic startup developers to physically grab the crazy old man and throw him off the property before he called the municipal police. The 2 muscular men stepped forward, eager to impress their arrogant host and secure their positions within the company. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not even look at them. I kept my eyes entirely locked on Bradley and continued walking straight toward the marble fireplace. My demeanor was so incredibly cold, so entirely devoid of any typical human hesitation or fear, that the 2 men instinctively stepped aside, sensing a lethal, unyielding force they completely lacked the courage to confront. The wealthy crowd parted silently as I crossed the room, leaving a wide, clear path directly to my corrupt son-in-law. Bradley's mocking smile faltered slightly as I closed the distance. The absolute lack of fear in my posture deeply unnerved him. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from him, aggressively invading his personal space, forcing him to look up from his champagne glass and meet my eyes. I reached slowly inside my denim jacket. Bradley flinched visibly, instinctively taking a half-step backward. I did not pull a weapon. I pulled out the sleek black leather folder containing the Toretti Syndicate's physical ledgers, the signed extortion contracts, and the brutal promissory notes. I held the folder directly over his crystal flute. I let the heavy damning documents slide out of the leather binding. They fell in a chaotic cascade, splashing heavily directly into his expensive champagne, soaking his tailored Italian suit, and scattering across the pristine white rug at his feet. Bradley stared down at the wet documents, his brain struggling to process the impossible sight. He recognized the syndicate's distinct red wax seal on the primary extortion contract instantly. The arrogant sneer vanished entirely from his face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He knew exactly what those papers represented. I turned my body slightly, addressing the completely silent room of wealthy investors and tech executives. I projected my voice with the crisp, undeniable authority of a federal auditor delivering a final, unassailable indictment. I announced clearly that Bradley Hayes was an absolute fraud. I informed his stunned financial backers that his highly touted application development startup was nothing more than a completely bankrupt shell company actively drowning in illegal underground debt. I stated for the public record that the historic house they were currently drinking in was subject to an immediate hostile federal foreclosure, and that Bradley's heavily leveraged luxury vehicles were actively being repossessed by municipal authorities at this exact moment. I turned my attention back to Bradley, leaning in close so only he and the venture capitalists standing directly beside him could hear the final devastating truth. I told him the offshore wire transfer he frantically initiated to purchase his personal safety had been permanently frozen by an emergency federal injunction. I informed him that the violent Toretti Syndicate no longer held his gambling markers. I had personally purchased his entire criminal debt portfolio with a certified untraceable bank draft exactly 1 hour ago. He did not owe the mafia a single dime. He owed me. I legally owned his massive debt, his fake startup, his freedom, and his miserable life. He was entirely at my mercy, and I had absolutely none left to give. The venture capitalists stared at the syndicate documents bleeding dark ink onto the white carpet, and immediately understood the catastrophic legal implications. The room instantly erupted into chaotic, pushing panic. The wealthy investors realized they had been thoroughly conned by a desperate degenerate and scrambled frantically toward the ruined front door, abandoning their drinks and fleeing the property to protect their own reputations and capital. Within 60 seconds, the grand living room was entirely deserted, save for Bradley and myself. Stripped of his wealthy audience, his stolen money, and his arrogant facade, Bradley completely snapped. The terrifying realization that his entire existence was now legally owned by the man he had actively tried to destroy shattered his fragile psyche. He let out a raw, guttural scream of pure, cornered desperation. He dropped his shattered champagne glass and spun toward the marble fireplace. He grabbed the heavy, solid brass fire poker from the hearth with both hands. His eyes rolled back with murderous intent as he raised the weapon high above his shoulder. He lunged across the white rug, bringing the heavy brass metal swinging down in a lethal sweeping arc aimed directly at the side of my head. The heavy, solid brass fire poker cut through the humid air of the living room with a deadly whistling hum. Bradley put the entire weight of his panicked, ruined existence behind the desperate, wild swing. His bespoke Italian suit jacket tore at the shoulder seam from the violent, uncalculated exertion. His face was twisted into a grotesque, ugly mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. All the polished corporate charm and fake Silicon Valley civility had been completely stripped away to reveal the cowardly, cornered, and violent animal underneath. He did not see me as his father-in-law or a fellow human being. He saw me as the absolute final obstacle standing between him and the luxurious, fraudulent life he felt entirely entitled to possess. As the heavy brass weapon hurled toward my temple, Bradley unleashed a guttural, feral roar that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of my stolen home. He screamed with absolute, malicious intent that he would bury me exactly where he had buried Yvonne. He shouted that my wife had died for absolutely nothing, and that I would join her deep in the dirt before he let me take a single cent of his offshore money. He genuinely believed his relative youth and physical size guaranteed him a swift, brutal victory against a 70-year-old man he had already written off as weak. He anticipated the sickening crunch of metal striking bone. He fully expected me to cower in fear, to raise my trembling hands in a futile, pathetic attempt to shield my face from the inevitable impact. He expected the frail, broken grandfather he had systematically designed on paper to finally manifest in physical reality. His eyes were wide with a sickening, anticipated triumph, completely blind to the lethal miscalculation he had just made. The heavy brass poker continued its downward arc, aimed perfectly to shatter my skull and end the entire legal and financial dispute in a single, irreversible act of extreme violence. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl as the polished metal caught the reflection of the bright overhead chandeliers, turning the weapon into a blinding streak of gold. Bradley had committed entirely to the swing, abandoning any sense of balance or defensive posture. He was completely exposed, fueled purely by adrenaline, and the terrified realization that he was backed into a corner with absolutely nowhere left to run from the syndicate debt I now owned. I did not retreat a single inch. Decades before I ever sat safely behind a Department of Justice desk analyzing encrypted financial ledgers. I survived 3 grueling combat tours in heavily contested hostile territories. The military had drilled a very specific, uncompromising physical response into my muscle memory, a response that completely ignored the natural human instinct to flinch away from incoming damage. You do not run from a sweeping weapon. You step directly into the attack. As the brass poker descended, I shifted my weight fluidly to my left foot, slipping perfectly inside the lethal arc of Bradley's wild swing. The heavy metal bludgeon missed my ear by a fraction of an inch, the displaced air brushing violently against my cheek. Bradley's momentum carried him completely forward, leaving his right arm overextended and entirely vulnerable. I struck with cold, mechanical precision. I drove my right palm upward in a punishing strike, catching Bradley perfectly under his exposed elbow. With my left hand, I seized his wrist in a vice grip, locking his arm into a rigid, unbreakable bar. I pivoted my hips, utilizing his own desperate forward momentum against him. I applied a brutal, agonizing military joint lock that required absolutely zero physical strength to execute only the precise, calculated application of skeletal leverage. I twisted his wrist sharply while driving my entire body weight directly downward into the trapped elbow joint. Bradley's feral scream of rage instantly transformed into a high-pitched, agonizing shriek of pure physical torment. He lost his grip entirely on the heavy brass poker. It clattered harmlessly onto the polished hardwood floor, spinning away into the shadows. I did not stop moving. I swept my right leg directly behind his knees, completely destroying his compromised center of gravity. Bradley collapsed heavily onto the floorboards, landing face down with a sickening, heavy thud. I dropped my knee directly between his shoulder blades, pinning his chest firmly against the wood so he could not breathe. I maintained the punishing grip on his right arm, pulling it sharply upward at an unnatural angle. A loud, distinct pop echoed through the silent living room as Bradley's shoulder joint fully dislocated from its socket. He thrashed violently against the floor, sobbing and gasping for air, the agonizing pain completely erasing his former arrogance. I held him pinned to the ground with minimal effort, feeling the rapid, terrified pounding of his heart against my knee. I leaned down close to his ear, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. I informed him that his financial ruin was merely the beginning of his consequences, and that physical violence against a trained combat veteran was the most foolish decision of his entirely foolish life. A piercing, hysterical scream shattered the tense aftermath of the brief physical struggle. Kendra had been hiding in the hallway during the confrontation, watching her husband's pathetic attempt at murder fail spectacularly. She burst into the living room, staring in absolute horror at Bradley pinned helplessly to the floorboards. She did not rush forward to aid him or comfort him in his obvious agony. Instead, She scrambled frantically backward, pulling her mobile phone from her designer handbag with shaking, desperate fingers. She dialed the emergency number, her voice pitching into a shrill, exaggerated display of pure panic. She screamed into the receiver that a violent, insane intruder had broken into her home and was actively murdering her husband. She played the helpless, terrified homeowner, flawlessly feeding the emergency dispatcher a completely fabricated narrative of an unprovoked, deadly assault by a deranged vagrant. She shouted our exact address, begging the police to send heavily armed officers immediately to save their lives. She dropped the phone on the carpet and backed against the wall, shooting me a look of venomous, triumphant malice. She firmly believed the arriving police would shoot me on sight to protect her. Through the broken front door, the distant rising wail of municipal police sirens began to cut through the humid night air. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the shattered entryway mere seconds before heavy combat boots stomped onto the front porch. 4 municipal police officers poured through the ruined doorframe with their service weapons drawn and leveled squarely at my chest. Kendra pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, screaming that I was the violent intruder trying to kill her husband. She ordered them to shoot the crazy old man before he snapped Bradley's neck. The officers moved in a tight, tactical formation, their flashlights cutting through the dim corners of the living room. The lead officer, a burly police sergeant with silver hair at his temples, kept his sidearm raised. He shouted a harsh, commanding order for me to step away from the bleeding man on the floor and place my hands exactly where he could see them. I slowly lifted my head and looked the sergeant directly in the eyes in the harsh, tactical light. The sergeant froze instantly. He stared at my face, a look of profound, genuine shock, replacing his tactical aggression. He immediately lowered his service weapon sharply, signaling his squad to stand down. He easily recognized Harlan Thorne, the anonymous primary benefactor who single-handedly funded the municipal police pension charity. The silver-haired municipal police sergeant did not holster his weapon immediately, but the barrel drifted decisively downward, aimed squarely at the floorboards rather than my chest. He barked a sharp command, and his tactical unit instantly pivoted their flashlights and weapons, redirecting from me to the writhing, pathetic figure of Bradley Hayes. Kendra shrieked in absolute protest, demanding they shoot me, but the sergeant ignored her completely. He recognized me not as a violent vagrant, but as the quiet, anonymous philanthropist who had fully funded the department's Widows and Orphans charity for the last decade. I stood perfectly upright and calmly informed the sergeant that the bleeding man on the floor had just attempted blunt force trauma to my skull with a brass fire poker after realizing his massive federal fraud had been completely exposed. The sergeant nodded grimly, his jaw tight. He informed me that exactly 20 minutes prior to their dispatch call, the precinct captain had received a highly encrypted, comprehensive digital file dump directly from Apex Capital. Mitchell had executed his orders flawlessly. The files contained absolute, irrefutable proof of Bradley's forged medical proxy, the illegal offshore wire transfers, and his deep financial ties to the Toretti extortion syndicate. The physical assault simply added an aggravated felony charge to an already insurmountable pile of federal indictments. 2 officers hauled Bradley up by his uninjured arm, ignoring his high-pitched squeals of pain as his dislocated shoulder shifted grotesquely. They slammed him aggressively against the restored marble fireplace, securing his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs, while reciting his Miranda rights with practiced mechanical efficiency. Bradley wept openly, his expensive Italian suit torn and stained, babbling incoherent excuses and begging the officers to listen to him. They did not care. They marched the ruined tech executive through the shattered front door, completely disregarding Kendra, who was clawing frantically at the officers' tactical vests in a futile attempt to stop the arrest. The heavy steel doors of the police cruiser slammed shut outside, sealing Bradley inside a cage he would never truly escape. Kendra was left standing completely alone in the center of the ruined foyer, surrounded by the shattered glass of the decorative mirror and the splintered remains of the heavy oak door. The flashing red and blue lights of the departing police cruisers painted her pale face in stark, pulsating shadows. The wealthy investors had abandoned her without a backward glance. Her husband was chained in the back of a municipal transport vehicle, facing decades in federal prison. Her fabricated reality was rapidly imploding, but her deeply ingrained survival instinct drove her toward immediate selfish action. She needed massive amounts of liquid capital to secure a high-powered criminal defense attorney and post the astronomical bail the judge would inevitably demand for Bradley before he broke under interrogation. She wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks, kicked off her designer heels, and sprinted up the grand staircase toward Bradley's private home office. She locked the heavy mahogany door behind her, gasping for air, and threw herself into his executive desk chair. She booted up his encrypted workstation, her manicured fingers flying frantically across the keyboard as she bypassed the primary firewalls. Bradley had always boasted about his heavily inflated founder shares in the application development startup, claiming the equity was an untouchable safety net worth millions in liquid cash. Kendra navigated directly to the corporate banking portals, intent on instantly liquidating every single share to generate untraceable capital. She hit the final authorization prompt, expecting to see a massive digital transfer confirmation. Instead, the screen flashed a solid, uncompromising wall of bright red text, indicating absolute system lockout. Access denied. Account frozen. Corporate liquidation complete. Kendra stared at the high-definition monitor, her heart hammering against her ribs as she desperately refreshed the page again and again. The result remained identical. She opened the primary administrative logs and discovered the terrifying truth of her predicament. Exactly 1 hour ago, Apex Capital had executed a devastating, flawlessly legal hostile takeover of the entire startup. By purchasing Bradley's underground debt portfolio directly from the Toretti syndicate, I legally acquired all the leveraged collateral tied to those illicit loans. Bradley had foolishly used his company shares to guarantee his gambling markers. I had immediately called those markers in. Mitchell had swiftly routed the paperwork through the federal courts, instantly dissolving the startup and absorbing every single asset into the Apex holding accounts. Bradley's equity was worth absolutely nothing. The company was completely gutted, the accounts were entirely drained, and Kendra was staring at a digital balance of absolute zero. She picked up the heavy crystal paperweight from the desk and hurled it violently at the computer monitor, shattering the screen into a spiderweb of dead pixels. She was completely trapped, financially ruined, and staring down the barrel of her own legal destruction. Less than 2 hours later, a heavy knock rattled the door of my secure temporary suite at a private downtown hotel. I unfastened the deadbolt and pulled the door open to find Kendra standing in the dimly lit hallway. She pushed past me uninvited, radiating an aura of frantic manufactured panic. She collapsed onto her knees in the center of the room, executing the exact same theatrical display of weeping victimization she had attempted in my office earlier that day. She grabbed the fabric of my denim jacket, sobbing uncontrollably, spinning a desperate, frantic narrative designed to completely absolve herself of guilt. She explicitly claimed that Bradley was a violent, manipulative monster who had forced her into participating in the real estate fraud against her will. She swore under her breath that he physically threatened her daily, demanding she trace my signature and fabricate the medical history for the corrupt psychiatrist just to keep the mafia at bay. She begged for my forgiveness, pleading with me to protect her from the federal fraud charges that were inevitably coming down the pipeline. I stood perfectly still, looking down at my daughter with absolute clinical detachment. I did not offer a single word of comfort. My eyes systematically scanned her trembling frame, registering the slight, unnatural stiffness in her posture and the deliberate way she leaned her chest toward my face. Then I saw it. Tucked discreetly beneath the ruffled collar of her expensive silk blouse, a microscopic LED light pulsed with a faint, rhythmic green glow. She was wearing a concealed digital wire. She was actively attempting to entrap me. She wanted to record me threatening her or admitting to an illegal extortion scheme to use as leverage for her own immunity deal with the district attorney. I did not back away or raise my voice in anger. I leaned down slowly, bringing my face mere inches from her hidden collar. I spoke directly into the concealed microphone with absolute freezing clarity. I systematically listed the exact state and federal penal codes she had personally violated. I detailed her explicit involvement in the forgery, her premeditated elder abuse, and her active conspiracy to commit wire fraud. I stated clearly for the recording that she was a willing, uncoerced participant in a hostile takeover of my estate. I then smiled a cold, empty expression that made her blood run entirely cold. I formally thanked her for bringing the active recording device directly to me, ensuring that her unsolicited, detailed confession to the forgery was now permanently logged on a digital audio file. I instructed her to deliver the wire directly to the municipal police station, noting that the federal prosecutors would be thrilled to receive her fully recorded admission of guilt. The sterile environment of the federal grand jury room offered no comfort and absolutely no hiding places for guilty men. The heavy acoustic paneling absorbed every sound, creating a suffocating vacuum where only the absolute unvarnished truth could survive. I sat in the back row of the gallery, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, watching the massive machinery of justice systematically grind Bradley's life into fine dust. The federal prosecutor, a razor-sharp veteran of the Financial Crimes Division, stood confidently before the 23 grand jurors. She did not rely on emotional appeals or theatrical courtroom tactics. She utilized the exact digital ledgers, bank records, and physical extortion files I had personally acquired from the Toretti syndicate. She meticulously outlined the sheer desperate magnitude of Bradley's underground gambling debts, projecting the grim numbers onto a large display screen for the entire room to witness. She painted a vivid, undeniable picture of a cornered man willing to commit massive federal fraud to save his own life from violent loan sharks. The jurors stared at the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts Bradley had frantically utilized to bypass standard banking protocols. The prosecutor detailed the sudden, incredibly suspicious real estate listing of my historic home and the subsequent lightning-fast cash sale designed entirely to liquidate my generational wealth. She firmly asserted that Bradley had maliciously orchestrated the entire psychiatric hold as a desperate, fraudulent mechanism to seize control of an estate he had absolutely no legal right to touch. The evidence was overwhelming, stacked in neat, undeniable piles of certified bank drafts and the recorded confession I had extracted from his wife. The prosecutor played a brief segment of Kendra's wire recording, letting her tearful admission of forgery echo through the silent room. Bradley closed his eyes as his wife's voice meticulously detailed their coordinated assault on my sanity. The grand jurors took furious notes, their expressions hardening with every undeniable piece of evidence laid before them. Bradley sat beside his newly retained defense counsel, his posture rigid, his face completely drained of its usual arrogant color. He was trapped in a windowless room entirely surrounded by the damning physical manifestations of his own monumental cowardice. Despite the crushing weight of the federal evidence, Bradley's high-priced defense attorney stood up to address the room. He was a man who charged astronomical hourly rates precisely because he possessed the sociopathic ability to spin blatant lies into plausible legal theories. He smoothly adjusted his tailored suit and confidently approached the jurors. He attempted a masterful, calculated pivot. He completely ignored the syndicate debts, waving them away as a tragic but legally irrelevant personal failing of a stressed tech entrepreneur. Instead, he aggressively anchored his entire defense on the absolute legitimacy of the medical proxy. He argued with manufactured passion that Bradley had acted purely in good faith to protect a severely mentally ill man from destroying his own estate. He spun a narrative portraying me as a paranoid, deeply disturbed senior citizen, prone to violent delusions and dangerous financial behavior. He claimed my hostile purchase of the syndicate debt was the ultimate proof of an unhinged, irrational mind lashing out at a loving family. To solidify this fabricated reality, the attorney called Dr. Arrington to the witness stand. The corrupt psychiatrist walked to the front of the room, raising his right hand to swear an oath he had already completely abandoned for offshore cash. Arrington sat down, his eyes darting nervously around the sterile room, completely avoiding my cold gaze in the gallery. The heavy layer of nervous perspiration was back beading along his receding hairline. He answered the defense attorney's leading questions with rehearsed clinical precision. He testified that he had personally examined me and found me suffering from advanced aggressive dementia. He stated for the federal record that I lacked the fundamental cognitive capacity to manage my own affairs, claiming I posed a severe physical and financial danger to myself and my family. He described my calm demeanor during the evaluation as a classic symptom of psychotic detachment. He adamantly swore that his medical evaluation was entirely objective, totally independent, and conducted without any external pressure or financial incentive from Bradley. The defense attorney thanked the doctor, turning to the jury with a look of solemn vindication. He declared that Bradley was not a criminal mastermind, but a desperate, loving son-in-law forced to make an agonizing medical decision to save an incompetent man from absolute ruin. The attorney smiled confidently, assuming the medical testimony had effectively planted the seed of reasonable doubt necessary to derail the indictment. The federal prosecutor did not immediately cross-examine the sweating doctor. Instead, she called me to the witness stand. I walked past Bradley's table without a single glance and sat down in the wooden chair. I did not waste the court's time presenting the clean, comprehensive cognitive evaluations Mitchell had already secured from 3 independent board-certified neurologists. Clean health records could be debated by expensive lawyers. Financial ledgers could not. I reached into the inside pocket of my denim jacket and produced a single certified banking manifest. I read the numbers aloud, with brutal surgical precision. I did not just accuse Dr. Arrington of medical malpractice. I provided the exact offshore routing numbers proving Bradley had initiated a direct, heavily encrypted wire transfer of exactly $50,000 into Arrington's private Cayman Islands account. I recited the precise digital timestamp, proving the illicit funds had been deposited exactly 2 hours before the corrupt doctor ever stepped foot inside my holding room. I explicitly outlined the devastating trajectory of the bribe connecting Bradley's depleted startup capital directly to the physician's desperate attempts to cover his own insurmountable illegal gambling debts. I laid the certified financial evidence flat on the wooden railing, transforming the doctor's sworn medical testimony into a glaring, undeniable act of federal perjury. The courtroom went dead silent as the sheer magnitude of the corruption was laid bare. Dr. Arrington stared at the routing numbers, his face turning the color of wet ash. The realization that he had just committed federal perjury in a grand jury room completely shattered his remaining nerve. He began to stammer uncontrollably, his hands shaking violently as the prosecutor demanded an explanation for the offshore deposit. Arrington panicked. He frantically invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, pushed his chair back so violently it crashed to the floor, and literally fled the witness stand. He bolted through the heavy wooden doors, abandoning his medical career and his fraudulent conspirator in a desperate bid for survival. The grand jury did not require another single second of deliberation. They immediately handed down a unanimous federal indictment against Bradley on all counts of wire fraud conspiracy and elder abuse. Out in the polished marble hallway, Bradley's high-priced defense attorney calmly snapped his leather briefcase shut. He looked at Bradley with absolute professional disgust, informed him that he did not represent federal perjurers, and walked away, leaving Bradley completely alone and utterly destroyed. Bradley sat in a windowless federal holding cell for exactly 48 hours before desperation drove him to the absolute bottom of the city's financial food chain. Without his legitimate corporate assets and entirely stripped of his high-priced legal counsel, he could no longer rely on sterile bank transfers. He utilized his one allowed phone call to contact a notoriously violent bail bondsman closely tied to the remaining dregs of the Toretti syndicate. He mortgaged his own physical safety, securing his astronomical federal bail with exorbitant underground interest rates that guaranteed his execution if he failed to pay. Bradley walked out of the detention center with a tracking monitor strapped to his ankle and a singular venomous goal. If he was going down, he would completely destroy my public reputation on his way to prison. He immediately regrouped with Kendra in a cheap motel room on the edge of the city. Together, they weaponized their victimhood. They scoured months of home security footage, carefully splicing together heavily edited out-of-context audio clips and silent video fragments. They took the footage of me kicking down the front door of my stolen home and paired it with manipulated audio files to create a terrifying, entirely fabricated narrative. Bradley bypassed legitimate journalists and leaked the digital package directly to a sensationalist, trashy local news network known for prioritizing scandalous ratings over factual verification. The evening broadcast ran the exclusive story as their leading headline. The fabricated video painted me as a tyrannical, ruthlessly wealthy abuser using his vast, unchecked financial power to systematically destroy a young, struggling African-American family. Bradley positioned himself as a hardworking tech entrepreneur, simply trying to build a future for his wife, while casting me as a vindictive, controlling patriarch, furious at their independence. The broadcast completely omitted the forged medical proxies, the offshore accounts, and the syndicate extortion. It presented a simple, easily digestible story of a rich, violent old man mercilessly crushing the American dream of his own blood relatives. The immediate public reaction was a swift, suffocating wave of collective outrage. I woke up the following morning to the glaring, intrusive lights of 3 separate news vans parked illegally across my front lawn. A chaotic swarm of aggressive reporters and freelance paparazzi heavily barricaded my driveway, their camera lenses pressed greedily against the wrought iron gates. When I stepped onto my front porch to retrieve the morning paper, a barrage of microphones was shoved toward my face through the iron bars. Reporters shouted relentless accusatory questions, demanding to know why I enjoyed terrorizing my only daughter and asking if I felt any remorse for violently assaulting a defenseless young man. I did not offer a single word of defense or explanation. I turned my back to the flashing cameras, walked inside, and firmly locked the heavy wooden door against the rising tide of public condemnation. The social fallout permeated every aspect of my daily existence. The neighborhood, once a quiet enclave of mutual respect, turned instantly hostile. People I had known for decades, individuals who had attended Yvonne's funeral and shared meals at my dining table, now crossed the street to avoid walking near my property. They glared at me with blatant, unfiltered disgust when I drove past them. The media smear campaign escalated rapidly throughout the week. Kendra embarked on a highly publicized, meticulously orchestrated media tour. She sat on the velvet couches of daytime talk shows, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue while delivering tearful, rehearsed interviews. She explicitly claimed that she lived in constant, paralyzing fear of her father. She spun a tragic tale of lifelong emotional abuse, heavily implying that my tyrannical behavior had driven her mother to an early grave. She painted a picture of a household ruled by fear, stating that my recent legal actions were merely a cruel, spiteful attempt to ruin her marriage out of pure jealousy. The public swallowed the narrative completely. The community saw a crying daughter and immediately condemned the silent father. Mitchell called me multiple times a day, frantically urging me to issue a press release or hire a crisis management firm to control the bleeding narrative. He warned me that public opinion could inevitably taint a future jury pool and jeopardize the upcoming federal fraud case. He wanted to issue cease and desist orders and file immediate defamation lawsuits against the network. I rejected his legal advice entirely. Engaging in a chaotic defensive shouting match in the court of public opinion would only validate their fabricated narrative and drag me down into their manufactured mud. I refused to hire a public relations firm or hide behind carefully crafted statements issued by expensive corporate spokespeople. I required a highly surgical, undeniable strike that bypassed the media entirely and delivered the absolute truth directly to the public. I drove my old sedan directly to the corporate headquarters of the exact same sensationalist local news network that had gleefully aired Bradley's fabricated video. I bypassed the aggressive reporters milling in the lobby and walked straight into the network's advertising sales department. I sat down across from a stunned executive director and presented a certified bank draft from my Apex Capital accounts. I did not ask for an interview or a chance to clear my name on their broadcast. I executed a straightforward commercial transaction. I purchased a single continuous 60-second block of prime-time commercial airtime. I specifically demanded the slot placed directly in the middle of their highest-rated evening news broadcast, ensuring maximum possible viewership. I paid triple their standard advertising rate to secure a binding contract guaranteeing the broadcast would air entirely unedited and uninterrupted. I handed the nervous executive a single encrypted digital storage drive containing my broadcast material. I did not offer any explanation regarding the contents of the drive. I simply demanded that they honor the incredibly lucrative contract they had just signed. I walked out of the network building completely ignoring the whispering staff and returned to the quiet solitude of my heavily guarded home to watch the evening news. At precisely 8 o'clock, the news anchor concluded a segment highlighting Kendra's latest tearful interview. The screen faded to black for a commercial break. No brightly colored advertisements or jingles appeared. A stark, pitch-black screen held the silence for 3 full seconds before a single line of crisp white text materialized to declare the truth. The audio recording I had extracted from the hidden microphone under Kendra's collar seamlessly combined with the raw surveillance audio I had captured outside their window, began to play at maximum volume. Bradley and Kendra's cruel, mocking voices filled living rooms across the entire city. Millions of viewers listened in stunned silence as the couple laughed hysterically about the thick red spray paint dripping down Yvonne's pristine marble headstone. They heard the cold, calculated joy in Kendra's voice as she meticulously detailed the plot to forge the medical proxy, lock me inside a state psychiatric facility, and systematically steal my entire financial fortune. The brutal 60-second broadcast ended, snapping back to a bewildered, wide-eyed news anchor who was completely speechless. The public reaction was instantaneous, violent, and absolutely explosive. The city did not just turn on Bradley and Kendra. It demanded their immediate destruction. The 60-second broadcast acted as an absolute uncompromising social guillotine. By dawn, the carefully constructed, fabricated narrative Kendra had weaponized was entirely annihilated. She foolishly attempted to maintain her pristine, wealthy facade by driving her leased luxury sedan directly to her position as the senior event director at the city's most exclusive elite country club. She walked through the polished glass doors, expecting sympathetic murmurs and validating hugs from her high society colleagues. Instead, she walked into a lobby of freezing, impenetrable stairs. The club's board of directors intercepted her immediately in the grand foyer, completely ignoring any pretense of professional courtesy in front of the maintenance staff and wealthy members. They loudly and explicitly terminated her employment contract on the spot, citing the catastrophic moral turpitude clause she had blatantly violated on regional television. They demanded she surrender her security keys and ordered security to escort her off the manicured property instantly. Her mobile phone, previously overflowing with eager messages of support from influential socialites, went entirely dead. The affluent friends who had happily drank her imported champagne and passionately validated her fake victimhood severed all ties with brutal, instantaneous efficiency. They completely scrubbed her from their social media accounts, permanently blocked her number, and publicly issued statements distancing themselves from the deeply disturbed woman who had gleefully laughed on tape about desecrating her own mother's grave. The resulting social exile was instantaneous, absolute, and utterly humiliating. Kendra was completely stripped of her perceived status, her lucrative income, and her entire meticulously curated identity long before the morning sun reached its peak. The local news anchors who had spent the previous 72 hours passionately validating her fabricated trauma were now issuing frantic, aggressive on-air apologies, completely reversing their stances to thoroughly condemn her absolute moral bankruptcy. She drove away from the country club gates in a state of hyperventilating shock. The local radio stations were already playing the leaked audio on a relentless loop, accompanied by furious commentary from listeners demanding her immediate arrest. The city had collectively turned its back on her, slamming every door she had spent years aggressively forcing open. The suffocating pressure of total public destruction and imminent federal prosecution permanently shattered their deeply toxic alliance. Back at the cheap, decaying motel on the industrial edge of the city, the illusion of their marital partnership dissolved into vicious, screaming recriminations. Kendra blamed Bradley entirely for their catastrophic financial ruin, shrieking hysterically that his underground gambling addiction and arrogant incompetence had systematically destroyed her perfect life. Bradley violently blamed Kendra, roaring that her staggering arrogance and complete failure to successfully entrap me on a wire recording had permanently sealed their legal fate. As Kendra locked herself in the cramped bathroom to frantically contact cheap criminal defense attorneys who aggressively demanded upfront cash retainers she no longer possessed, Bradley made his final cowardly move. He accessed Kendra's personal hidden banking application on her discarded laptop. Without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse, he ruthlessly drained the final $10,000 of her private emergency savings, transferring the stolen funds directly into an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet. He packed a single scuffed duffel bag, abandoned his weeping wife in the squalid motel, and fled out the back door into the blinding afternoon heat. He knew his federal ankle monitor would eventually trigger a perimeter alert, but blind, suffocating panic completely overrode any remaining shred of logical thought. He intended to purchase an anonymous cash ticket on a battered interstate bus heading deep south, desperately hoping to vanish into the sprawling anonymity of the border towns before the federal marshals noticed his unauthorized movement. He arrived at the deserted municipal bus terminal under the cover of darkness, sweating profusely beneath a cheap hooded sweatshirt, glancing over his shoulder with every frantic step. He never even made it to the ticketing counter. Two massive men wearing dark leather jackets and combat boots stepped out seamlessly from the deep shadows of the concrete pillars, completely blocking his path to the boarding platforms. They were the Toretti Syndicate enforcers, the brutal, uncompromising loan sharks who had originally financed his exorbitant bail to keep him on the street. They had been tracking his movements relentlessly since he fled the motel room. The larger man stepped forward with terrifying speed, shoving Bradley violently against the cold brick wall of the terminal and stripping him of his duffel bag with a single aggressive pull. Bradley gasped for air, his eyes wide with absolute terror, realizing his desperate attempt to escape had merely delivered him directly into the hands of the very men he feared most in the world. The larger syndicate enforcer produced a heavy steel collapsible baton from his jacket, pulling it open with a sharp, intimidating metallic crack that echoed across the empty terminal. He coldly informed Bradley that skipping town on an active syndicate debt required an immediate permanent physical penalty to maintain the organization's reputation. Bradley whimpered pathetically, sliding down the rough brick wall and raising his trembling hands to shield his face fully, expecting his legs to be completely shattered on the concrete. The enforcer raised the heavy steel weapon high above his shoulder, bracing his boots to deliver a crippling blow. A single sharp command cut through the humid night air. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the terminal corridor, directly flanking the two syndicate muscle. I did not raise my voice or break my steady, measured stride. I walked straight toward the group and calmly reminded the enforcers of the massive, certified bank draft currently sitting untouched in Vincent Toretti's private underground safe. I clearly and firmly restated the fundamental terms of our financial transaction. I legally owned Bradley's entire debt portfolio, which explicitly included the exorbitant bail bond they had recently issued. They were entirely unauthorized to physically damage my legal property. The enforcers lowered the steel baton, instantly recognizing the undeniable absolute shift in authority. I ordered them to step aside and hand the trembling fugitive directly over to the legitimate authorities, waiting exactly 1 block away. Two black federal SUVs screeched onto the terminal pavement, their tactical strobe lights flashing silently against the brick walls. 4 heavily armed United States Marshals swarmed the platform, moving with rapid, overwhelming efficiency. They hauled Bradley roughly off the concrete, completely ignoring his pathetic, uncontrolled sobbing and desperate pleas for mercy. They locked him securely into the reinforced steel back seat of the armored vehicle. He pressed his tear-streaked face against the thick, tactical glass, fully realizing that his desperate, cowardly flight had just guaranteed a maximum 10-year federal prison sentence without any possibility of early parole. As the heavy convoy sped away into the darkness, the absolute reality of the situation settled permanently over the city. Bradley was locked in a federal cage, entirely stripped of his fraudulent wealth and his manufactured dignity. Across town in a decaying motel room, Kendra sat entirely alone on a stained mattress. She stared blankly at a digital bank account displaying $0 and a phone screen empty of allies. She possessed absolutely nothing. She had no money, no husband, no social standing, and no father to manipulate. She simply sat in the suffocating silence, waiting in absolute terror for the inevitable knock of federal agents arriving to serve her own criminal indictment. The heavy reinforced steel doors of the federal courthouse closed behind me with a resounding final echo that signaled the absolute end of Bradley Hayes. The afternoon sky had turned a bruised, oppressive slate gray, perfectly matching the cold concrete of the wide steps leading down to the municipal parking lot. A biting, aggressive wind swept through the downtown corridor, carrying the metallic scent of impending rain and blowing dead leaves across the cracked pavement. I pulled the collar of my faded denim jacket tight against the chill and walked steadily toward my rusted sedan, my mind meticulously filing away the sheer panic I had just witnessed inside the grand jury room. Leaning heavily against the passenger side door of my vehicle was a figure completely devoid of the suffocating toxic arrogance that had previously defined her entire existence. Kendra looked entirely broken. The bespoke silk blouses, the flawless salon blowouts, and the heavy, expensive jewelry were completely gone, replaced by the harsh reality of sudden destitution. She wore a plain, oversized gray sweater that hung loosely off her trembling shoulders and a pair of faded dark jeans. Her face was entirely bare of makeup, exposing the deep, dark circles carved under her eyes by days of sheer panic and relentless federal scrutiny. She possessed absolutely nowhere else to go. The elite country club had publicly exiled her, her wealthy socialite friends had permanently blocked her number, and the federal marshals had completely seized her remaining physical assets. She stood shivering in the biting wind, clutching her arms tightly around her chest, waiting for the exact man she had explicitly conspired to destroy. She watched my steady approach with wide, desperate eyes, her posture shrinking submissively as I closed the distance between us. I did not alter my pace or offer a single gesture of paternal comfort. I unlocked my vehicle with a sharp mechanical click of the key fob. Kendra lunged forward immediately, desperate to intercept me before I could slide behind the steering wheel. She grabbed the edge of my denim jacket with freezing, trembling hands, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. She sobbed openly, shedding genuine tears born strictly from the terrifying reality of her impending federal indictment. She begged me to look at her, explicitly demanding that I recognize the absolute devastation of her current reality. She wept that she had absolutely nothing left, that she was entirely alone, and that the federal prosecutors were actively preparing to formally charge her as a willing co-conspirator. Kendra's grip tightened desperately on the rough fabric of my jacket. She frantically demanded that I utilize the massive liquid capital of the Apex holding accounts to immediately hire a high-powered criminal defense attorney for her. She explicitly stated that she required a top-tier legal team to negotiate a federal immunity deal and keep her out of a concrete penitentiary cell. She completely ignored the staggering irony of demanding financial salvation from the exact estate she had actively attempted to steal. When I maintained my cold, unyielding silence, she escalated her manipulation tactics, pivoting instantly from desperate pleading to aggressive emotional entitlement. She weaponized her biological status, leaning in close and staring into my eyes with frantic manic intensity. She declared loudly that she was my only daughter, asserting that my fundamental duty as a father was to protect her from absolute ruin, regardless of her treacherous actions. She claimed I owed her a relentless legal defense, insisting that my vast generational wealth was essentially useless if I allowed my own flesh and blood to be caged by the federal government. She demanded that I fulfill my paternal obligation to shield her from the brutal approaching consequences of the fraud she had willingly participated in. She completely failed to comprehend that biological ties do not excuse malicious, premeditated betrayal. When my expression remained entirely frozen and completely unresponsive to her aggressive entitlement, she reached for the most sacred, heavily guarded piece of my existence. She played her absolute final, most desperate card. Her voice dropped into a sharp, trembling whisper, deliberately engineered to inflict maximum emotional damage upon my psyche. She invoked the sacred memory of my late wife. Kendra explicitly stated that Yvonne would be completely disgusted by my unyielding coldness. She claimed with absolute certainty that her mother would have demanded I forgive her immediately, stating that Yvonne possessed a compassionate heart and would never allow her only child to suffer inside a federal holding facility. She actively weaponized the memory of the woman I had loved for 4 decades, twisting Yvonne's inherent kindness into a manipulative, vile tool to extort legal funding. She explicitly demanded that I honor my late wife's memory by completely ignoring the fact that she had actively conspired to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. She stared at me heavily panting, waiting for the weaponized mention of Yvonne to shatter my rigid resolve and force me into a blind emotional surrender. I stopped moving entirely. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had explicitly allowed the Toretti syndicate to desecrate Yvonne's pristine marble headstone with thick red spray paint. I stared at the person who had gleefully laughed on a hidden recording about the brutal violation of her own mother's final resting place. My voice was entirely stripped of anger, leaving only a freezing, absolute void that cut through the howling wind. I calmly informed Kendra that I had already paid for her entire existence. I stated clearly that I had funded her life, financed her lavish wedding, and purchased the historic home she had actively attempted to steal from under my feet. I provided a life of complete unearned privilege that she had deliberately chosen to weaponize against me. I explicitly reminded her that my fundamental obligations as a father ended the precise moment she willingly sat in a room with a corrupt psychiatrist and actively tried to erase my freedom and my sanity. I stated that Yvonne's memory belonged entirely to me, and that she possessed absolutely no right to invoke the name of a woman whose grave she had allowed to be aggressively defaced. I reached slowly into my jacket pocket, but I did not pull out a platinum credit card or a certified bank draft. I extracted a single, slightly bent business card printed on cheap, plain paper. I pressed the card firmly into Kendra's trembling hand. It was the contact information for a municipal temporary employment agency that exclusively placed unskilled laborers in minimum wage sanitation positions. I explicitly advised her to arrive early the following morning, noting that federal public defenders heavily favored clients who demonstrated a genuine willingness to engage in honest, legitimate manual labor. I stepped completely away from her, breaking her frantic grip on my jacket. I opened the door of my rusted sedan, slid behind the steering wheel, and pulled the door shut with a heavy metallic slam. I engaged the internal locks instantly, severing our connection completely. A loud crack of thunder echoed across the slate-gray sky, and the freezing rain began to fall in heavy, punishing sheets. I started the engine and drove slowly out of the municipal lot. I looked in the rearview mirror exactly once. Kendra stood completely alone on the wet pavement, clutching the cheap business card, shivering violently in the torrential downpour as her entire world finally washed away. The drive away from the federal courthouse was accompanied only by the rhythmic beat of the windshield wipers pushing the heavy rain aside. The bruised slate-gray sky gradually gave way to a muted, calming dusk as I navigated the familiar route back to my historic neighborhood. The aggressive, chaotic energy that had violently infected my life over the past week was completely gone, washed away by the relentless downpour and the definitive execution of federal justice. I turned onto my tree-lined street and immediately registered the profound, beautiful emptiness. The aggressive swarm of freelance paparazzi, the blinding lights of the local news vans, and the suffocating barricade of aggressive reporters had entirely vanished. The sensationalist local network had hastily packed up their equipment the exact second my unedited audio broadcast annihilated their fabricated victim narrative. My front lawn was completely clear of intruders. I pulled my rusted sedan into the driveway and shifted the engine into park. The silence of the neighborhood was absolute and respectful. The neighbors who had glared at me with unfiltered disgust just yesterday were securely locked inside their homes, thoroughly humiliated by their own rush to judgment, and entirely unwilling to meet my gaze. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked up the stone path toward the grand entryway. The heavy steel padlock that Bradley had so arrogantly installed was completely removed from the front door, replaced by a temporary heavy-duty deadbolt installed by the municipal police after they cleared the crime scene. I inserted the new brass key Mitchell had procured for me and turned it with a sharp, satisfying click. The heavy door swung open, and I stepped over the threshold, crushing no splinters beneath my work boots this time. The physical space officially belonged to me once again. The air inside felt different. It was no longer thick with the cloying scent of unearned arrogance or the suffocating weight of ongoing extortion. The atmosphere was incredibly still. I stood in the ruined foyer, breathing in the scent of aged mahogany and rain-soaked earth drifting in from the porch. The hostile occupation of my generational wealth was permanently terminated. I closed the front door firmly against the storm and engaged the heavy deadbolt. The silence inside my home was no longer a heavy, oppressive burden. It was pristine and restorative. I systematically moved through the grand living room, confronting the physical remnants of Bradley's disastrous, arrogant victory party. The white rug was still stained with spilled vintage champagne and the dark, bleeding ink of the Toretti Syndicate extortion files. The shattered remains of the crystal flute lay scattered across the polished hardwood floor, directly next to the heavy brass fire poker he had swung at my head with lethal intent. I did not hire a cleaning crew. I retrieved a heavy canvas trash bag and a broom from the utility closet. I methodically swept up every jagged shard of broken crystal and every splinter of the ruined oak door. I rolled up the soiled white rug, hauling the heavy stained fabric out to the municipal disposal bin in the alley. I wiped down the restored marble fireplace, completely erasing the sticky residue of expensive liquor and the lingering fingerprints of corporate sycophants. The physical labor was deeply therapeutic. It was a tangible, deliberate eradication of the toxic infection that had invaded my sanctuary. Once the interior was entirely scrubbed clean of Bradley's pathetic existence, I walked to the rear of the house and opened the heavy glass doors leading to the backyard. The rain had slowed to a gentle, steady drizzle. I stepped onto the wet grass and walked directly toward Yvonne's prized garden. The rose bushes she had meticulously cultivated for decades had been completely neglected during the hostile takeover. Overgrown, thorny branches choked the pathways, and heavy dead blossoms dragged the healthy stems down toward the muddy earth. I retrieved my heavy steel pruning shears from the wooden garden shed. I did not rush the process. I moved systematically down the row of bushes, applying a ruthless, calculating precision to the task. I isolated the dead, rotting wood that actively drained essential nutrients from the root system. I aligned the sharp steel blades and severed the dead branches with a crisp, definitive snap. I completely removed the parasitic growth, clearing the thick, suffocating canopy to ensure the healthy stems received unobstructed sunlight and oxygen. I piled the dead, thorny branches into a massive, tangled heap, preparing them for the incinerator. The garden looked radically different when I finally stepped back. It was smaller, leaner, and entirely stripped of unnecessary weight. It was primed for aggressive, healthy new growth. I stood in the quiet, rain-soaked garden, looking at the neatly pruned rows of vibrant green stems. The absolute defining truth of my existence settled firmly into my chest. The incredibly toxic infection that had masqueraded as a loving family had been entirely surgically removed from my life. I had permanently lost the comforting illusion of a loyal daughter and a respectable son-in-law. But I understood clearly that those specific individuals had never genuinely existed. They were carefully constructed, parasitic facades, designed strictly to drain my resources and actively plot my destruction. I had forcefully stripped away their deceit, choosing absolute reality over a comfortable, extortionate lie. I did not mourn the loss of their presence. I felt a profound, untouchable serenity. By executing a flawless, unyielding counterstrike against their federal fraud, I had successfully preserved the sacred honor of Yvonne's memory. I had defended the generational wealth we built together from absolute ruin. More importantly, I had protected my own sanity and maintained my uncompromised dignity in the face of absolute betrayal. I was completely alone, but I was entirely free. The following morning, the brilliant sunlight broke through the lingering storm clouds, illuminating the freshly washed city streets. I drove my rusted sedan down to the modest, chrome-lined diner situated on the edge of the industrial district. Mitchell was already seated in the back booth, his expensive tailored suit, a sharp contrast to the cracked red vinyl seating. I slid into the booth opposite my attorney, wearing my comfortable, faded denim jacket. The waitress dropped 2 heavy ceramic mugs of black coffee on the laminated table without a word. Mitchell did not present any legal briefs or federal indictment files. The complex, highly dangerous operation was entirely concluded. We sat in companionable, absolute silence, drinking the bitter, scalding coffee. I turned my head and looked out the rain-streaked window at the bustling city shifting into its daily routine. The pedestrians moving across the wet pavement had absolutely no idea how close I had come to total annihilation, or how ruthlessly I had reversed the trajectory of my own destruction. I took a slow, measured breath, completely at peace, knowing I had protected my legacy with absolute terrifying precision. The following morning, the brilliant sunlight broke through the lingering storm clouds, illuminating the freshly washed city streets. I drove my rusted sedan down to the modest, chrome-lined diner situated on the edge of the industrial district. Mitchell was already seated in the back booth, his expensive tailored suit a sharp contrast to the cracked red vinyl seating. I slid into the booth opposite my attorney, wearing my comfortable, faded denim jacket. The waitress dropped 2 heavy ceramic mugs of black coffee on the laminated table without a word. Mitchell did not present any legal briefs or federal indictment files. The complex, highly dangerous operation was entirely concluded. We sat in companionable, absolute silence, drinking the bitter, scalding coffee. I turned my head and looked out the rain-streaked window at the bustling city shifting into its daily routine. The pedestrians moving across the wet pavement had absolutely no idea how close I had come to total annihilation, or how ruthlessly I had reversed the trajectory of my own destruction. I took a slow, measured breath, completely at peace, knowing I had protected my legacy with absolute, terrifying precision. True strength is not measured by the absolute volume of your anger, but by the freezing, calculated precision of your boundaries. When toxic individuals weaponize your inherent love and generational sacrifices to orchestrate your utter destruction, allowing them continued access is not a form of moral grace. It is deliberate self-sabotage. The most profound act of self-preservation requires the ruthless amputation of parasitic relationships, completely regardless of any shared biological ties. Preserving your personal dignity and safeguarding your legacy often demands a solitary, uncompromising walk. Real peace only flourishes in environments entirely scrubbed clean of calculated deceit and manufactured affection. Did you enjoy this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you are listening from. If this story resonated with you, like the video and subscribe to the channel for more life stories about standing strong, setting absolute boundaries, and maintaining your uncompromised dignity in the face of betrayal.